Hey, welcome everybody. We're so excited today to talk to you all about Milestones Asset Maps. I see there's already a lot of thinking around assets in the chat. I saw funds of knowledge. I saw folks talking about their experiences, about students' experiences, and we're going to explore that more together as a group today. To get us started, we're going to do some introductions as well as share about what's happening today. I'm June, the design lead for the Milestones Initiative as Student Achievement Partners, kicking it off for us today. Next, we're going to get to hear from Phil Darrow to talk about why Milestones Asset Maps. Many of you all likely know about Phil Darrow, but luckily he's one of our national experts who has been advising and designing on the Milestones team since its inception. Then we're going to get to hear from two of our educators, Rachel Erickson and Ariel McDaniel, share their story about their experience with Milestones Asset Maps. They've been co-designing with us this past year. And lastly, we're going to get to hear from Sandra Lightman, our Director of Strategic Partnerships, share about opportunities for this upcoming school year to partner with us around this resource. Now, there are many team members that make this work possible, some of whom I will highlight today. From Student Achievement Partners, we have Stacy, Amber, and Silver. You'll see Stacy and Amber in the chat as well, actively supporting you and helping us lift things from the chat that we should voice over during the webinar. And then we are blessed to also have the expertise of national experts, Harold Astorius and John Staley, alongside Phil Darrow to help who've been instrumental in shaping the direction of the Milestones Initiative. So before we dive into Milestones Asset Maps, we wanted to spend a minute grounding ourselves in why Milestones in the first place. So I know the slide reads that Milestones puts the most important mathematics of the grade level on a single page as a grid of tasks. That describes what it does, but why? Why this emphasis on tasks? One of our taglines is, because standards are the language of policymakers, and tasks are the language of the mathematics classrooms. Tasks prompt us to think about students doing math, how they might make sense of the mathematics, what representations they might use, what moves I, as a teacher, can make to understand their thinking and to advance it. The Milestones tasks were designed to foster rich and revealing discussions for educators and for students. And the tasks were carefully crafted so that each grade's tasks are a visualization of the grade level standards on one page. We encourage you to listen to our first webinar to hear about the power of Milestones for professional learning and for developing students' identity, agency, and language as part of their journey towards understanding grade level mathematics. That's enough from me. I'm going to turn it over to Phil to talk to us about why Milestones Asset Maps.
Yes, the grid of tasks at each grade level expresses as June said, the language of the classroom. That is, that's what in the moment teachers and students are focused on. And asset-based teaching is something many of us have embraced, but there hasn't been enough help for teachers in terms of what is an asset in the moment while I'm teaching. And so we set out to answer that question for teachers. And the reason that asset-based teaching, I think, has attracted so much attention is we've learned, oftentimes the hard way, even the tragic way, that the path from deficits to grade level is too long and too torturous, and few survive. And the best path to grade level understanding begins with something the student knows, not with something they don't know. We have to begin where they are, which means begin with what they know. It doesn't mean begin with where they aren't. And too much of the work has been, diagnosing what they don't know and filling gaps. That doesn't work. So because it doesn't work to start from what they don't know, and it doesn't work to assume what they know. We actually need to know what they know, and we need to know in the moment. So in the next slide, what is an asset? how will the teachers recognize the assets in the moment of teaching a particular task? What prompts can the teacher use once they see what the student knows? How can they pull them towards grade level? What prompts can they use to advance their thinking? And how can the assets that have come up among the different assets, among different students, be used in whole class discussion to bring everyone from their different starting places to a common grade level understanding? Asset maps were developed to answer these questions. So next slide. So let's start with advancing students' thinking. So students show their assets as they work on grade level problems. They start working on a problem, they get so far and they've done some good work, and then they either get something wrong, or they stall, or they stop. Something has stopped them. They can't get all the way. And what you see, where do you see the assets that they have so far? You see it in their talk, what they say, in their drawing, in their writing, in whatever calculations they're starting to do. That's the evidence. That's what's observable. That's where to look for the assets. And different students will show you different things because different students will have different ways of thinking. And this idea of way of thinking is a very important idea, because that's where the assets are. And each way of thinking brings its own assets. What we found is that for a given task, in a whole class full of students, there will only be 3, 4, at most 5 different ways of thinking across all of the students. And if you have the prompts for each of those 3 or 4 or 5 in your back pocket, then you can move the whole class to the grade level. So that's what we set out to do with asset maps. For each task in the grid, what were the different ways of thinking? Identifying them with our collaborating teachers, with what we know from the research, and what would be good questions for each of those ways of thinking for a teacher to ask a student as they were walking around the room watching them work. And so if they see a pair of students collaborating that are bogged down, or they're stalled, or they're running in circles, when the teacher gets there, they can identify the way of thinking because we've already got those mapped out, and they can connect it and match to each way of thinking is a question to ask those students to unstick them and move them towards grade level. So, you know, if a student has drawn a number line with 1/5 on it, but then they've stalled, what can you do to get the students moving again? Direct their attention back to the problem itself, so that we have a question like, what does the 1/5 refer to in the problem, and get them thinking about it. The other way in which the ways of thinking are useful, the assets that come out of the ways of thinking, is in the whole class discussion that you would have towards the end of working on the task, and you're trying to herd all the students together to a common grade level understanding. So there we've identified which ways of thinking should go up on the board and have the students collect and compare 3 or 4 ways and look for what's the same, what's different in the different ways of thinking. And what we know from research and experience and practices of so many good teachers, that when students get beyond their own way of thinking and listen to the way of thinking of a different way of thinking from another student, that extends their understanding of the mathematics. That breaks through because they're seeing the same mathematics from a different angle. And if you can see that mathematics from 3 or 4 different angles, your understanding is going to deepen and advance. And that's the purpose of the class discussion. Not to just appreciate different ways of thinking, but to actually do the work of making your mind get around a different person's way of thinking, a different way. And that way, from the different starting places, we can find a common understanding of the mathematics. And so to move on to the next slide. I'm putting June to the test. The other thing about focusing on the student's way of thinking that's so important is that it's a way of showing respect for the student. And the way you show respect in an asset-based teaching so that you get the full benefit of motivation and agency and mindset is by respecting their way of thinking. And the way that respect is shown is by doing the work to understand their way of thinking. That often means asking them a question or giving them a question. And if the teacher is modeling how to understand someone else's way of thinking, the other students will start respecting each other and respecting their way of thinking. We're not just respecting them and how they feel, we're respecting their ideas. And in order to respect someone's ideas, you have to do some work to understand them. You have to ask them some questions and pay attention to their specific concrete work, including their talk. So working to understand the assets of each student winds up being working to understand their way of thinking and connecting it to the grade level way of thinking. And this kind of respect will automatically bring with it a respect for the student's background, where they're coming from, whether it's culturally or just might be a peculiar way they like to think about mathematics, from what they bring from earlier grades. It's not focusing on what they don't bring. It's focusing on what they bring, respecting it, and then extending it towards the grade level. But for the teachers to do that in the moment, they need concrete questions that match concrete ways of thinking. And what you're going to see in a moment is how we've done that for the tasks in the milestone grids. And since each milestone grid is the whole grade level presented in tasks, by doing this for those problems, this will give teachers questions for the most important task of the grade level that are specific and usable in the moment. So I'm going to turn it over to June, and we're going to see what sense you've made of what we've done so far.
Thank you, Phil. So there was a lot of rich food for thought that probably you all are processing. So we wanted to give folks a moment to process and also see kind of what's resonating across the audience. So in a moment, you're going to see a poll link in the chat, or you could use your phone. We'd love for you to get to this poll and respond with what word, phrase, or ideas are sticking with you about why Milestones Asset Maps were developed. I'll keep the slide up for a minute, and then we'll look to see what's resonating with folks. Okay. You give another 30 seconds or so, but you can kind of see what folks are resonating with. Some of the mechanics that I see is around students and teachers, around students thinking, around what teachers can do, around what students are bringing. And we're landing on kind of the impact of taking this approach, which is a respectful classroom that's probably felt. I'll welcome an additional voiceover before we transition. Feel free to continue adding some ideas as you can, but we wanted to get to the part that probably is on many folks' minds, if I can exit out of this, which is what might an asset map look like, or what is comprised in an asset map. So we want to take you through a mini experience to further reflect on the use of an asset map, or kind of like what you're making sense of now. We know it's an idea that is new for a lot of folks, but we wanted you to be able to reflect on that through the lens of a math milestones task. So right now what you're looking at is the grade 5 grid, and you're going to be working on this task, the frozen yogurt machine. In a minute, we're going to send you into breakouts. You'll have about 10 minutes or so we recommend you first start by introducing yourself, and then independently, so potentially you want to go off camera, take about 3 minutes or so to work on this task using the math that you know, and then come back off camera and spend the remaining of that time beginning a conversation about your thinking, as well as 2 other students' thinking that you're seeing about this task. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you all got to begin that conversation, but we know with some folks entering breakouts late and a couple of folks needing the link again, you might have felt like you needed a lot more time. And I feel like that always happens in breakouts. But hopefully you got a chance to look at the frozen yogurt tasks and begin to share some of your approaches, begin to analyze 2 students' thinking about the task, and to begin to discuss what are some of the assets that you see in their thinking, as well as how you leverage those assets in students' thinking to help everyone make sense of grade level mathematics. We wanted you to begin to have that experience because these are the 2 questions that drove us to create Math Milestones Asset Maps. And so I want to take a minute to talk a little bit more about what you can expect with a Math Milestones Asset Map. The Math Milestones Asset Maps, they build on the Math Milestones tasks to offer educators insights that are supportive of planning, instruction, and next steps. With an asset map, you have an opportunity to look at student work, identify and acknowledge the assets in that thinking, and then think about how to advance that thinking with a just right next question that builds from the asset. Each map is comprised of 3 components. There's a front matter that discusses more about the grade level mathematics and considerations for equitable math instruction. There's a middle section to support instructional decisions when monitoring student thinking. And there's a final section to support instructional decisions when facilitating this course. It's a resource that's meant to support teacher decision-making and to deepen content knowledge as well as pedagogical content knowledge through the study of student thinking. This resource is under development and proprietary of student achievement partners. We're going to be sharing more about how we hope to partner with you and ways to reach out if you're interested in using this tool. Before we talk more about that, I wanted to turn it over to our educators so that we can hear more about their experience using an asset map. And first, we're going to get to hear from Rachel. Please feel free, as you're listening to Rachel share her story, to type questions in the chat. She will be focused on sharing her story, but we do have folks who are monitoring the chat, and as possible, we'll elevate questions for Rachel at the end of the section. But that's it. I'll turn it over to Rachel. Wait, Rachel, you were on mute, so we get to start again.
Okay, good. I got practice. Hello, everyone. I am Rachel Erickson from Centennial, Colorado, and I work in the Cherry Creek School District as an English language support specialist. Prior to this role, I worked in Aurora Public Schools as a classroom teacher and instructional coach and an interventionist. And for the past year, I've been really lucky to work with these fabulous people at Student Achievement Partners to dive into some of the Math Milestones tasks and asset maps. And I'm happy to be here to share with you some of my experience. You can go on. The first thing that drew me to asset maps was that it's very learning focused. Oftentimes, we find that curriculum can be written with an emphasis on what teachers and students should do. And so we get into that habit of solving problems just to get to the answer. And we're focusing on getting through the tasks versus thinking about what are the essential understandings that we want students to develop about the math. So Math Milestones supports teachers in building that understanding of those math learning goals, as well as offers potential ways that you can interact with students during their learning about their learning and about those goals. So other than just making sense of mathematics, it also does honor students' ideas, lived experiences, and knowledge. That it invites different ways of contributing to the learning community. So there's not just one right way to show up in math class or to be a mathematician. It's really the asset piece where we're talking on what students already have and already know that we're going to build from to get to that grade level understanding. So I did have the opportunity to work with several different teachers in different grade levels through with some asset maps. And the process that we followed was first to understand the math, then to focus on potential assets, and then plan for how we would facilitate the learning. So I just wanted to share some guiding questions with you, so June can bring those up. First, we thought about, what are the major standards for the grade level, and what is the essential understanding, and where in the learning progression does this come? And the front matter piece that June was just referencing from Milestones, there's a teacher reference guide. It does support us with pulling out those essential ideas and what students may have learned from in a previous grade as well. So that's all embedded within there. The second part about thinking about potential assets, we know we can build from prior grade level understandings. We can also build from students' other experiences. And then the advancing questions are probably the most valuable piece that I found when using this. It did help me make decisions in the moment. So once I knew kind of what the goal was and what questions I could use if I saw certain things from kids to help move everybody toward that grade level understanding, that was the biggest piece that I took away from the asset map. And then lastly was thinking about when to use the task, at what point in the unit, how would we facilitate it in terms of the launch? Would we be working with students working in groups or individually? What materials might be available to them? All of those different types of things. And then the asset piece, I think this is really kind of the key piece of the asset map, was the advancing questions. Prior to using asset maps, I would think about what questions I might ask or what questions could help support students with the learning, but I didn't know how to leverage what they were doing already to get them closer to that grade level. So the advancing questions really are focusing on what are students saying, doing, thinking now, and how do I then get them to think in a different way, think deeper, or think about something in addition that can move them along. So here's an example from second grade. The standard that we selected was a very big standard. So it's thinking about addition and subtraction word problems. By the end of second grade, students are expected to master all different types of word problems. So this task was given near the end of second grade. The next piece here is a part of a resource from the Math Milestones. I did select a compare task because comparison problems involve the idea of a relationship between quantities versus like an action where you're putting together or taking apart. So students are pretty good at that type of problem when by the time they get to second grade, they've done a lot of joining problems or separating problems. But comparison problems are a little bit more complex in the language that's used to describe that relationship and just the fact that there's no necessarily an action attached to it. So I looked through the curriculum and I found a lot of different opportunities for kids to solve problems where their difference was unknown. So they were asked how many more, how many fewer, those types of questions. What I didn't see in our curriculum was opportunities for kids to think about problems where the bigger or the smaller quantity was unknown. So because of that, I decided to go with one of those tasks. So on the next screen is the actual task that I selected, and I'll give you a second to read through it. Okay. All right, June, if you want to go on, hopefully that was enough time. So this front matter here, again, this is directly from the asset map. So we have the task about apple picking. And then this is where teachers are supported with what's the learning goal, what's the mathematics that we want kids to understand. So in this case, we want students to understand that it's comparing two values and that they can represent the solution with an equation, but also know what those numbers mean in the problem. So this teaching point about quantities was kind of what I focused on, was understanding if kids can understand what the quantities represent in this problem, then they have a way into finding a solution and representing it as well. I also took into the fact that if they just add, they will get the right answer, but they may not understand the relationship piece. Adding is a very common thing to do in second grade. So some kids just see numbers and let's add them. So we wanted to make sure that kids were making sense of the problem. And that's where the grade level piece comes in. So it's that not just being able to get an answer, but understand the comparison. So these two pieces here were specifically from the asset map with the idea of potential assets that we might see from kids. When I thought about the specific students in the class, I thought I might see a variation of students representing Marlon having 12 apples and Malia having 13 apples. They're seeing the numbers So whether or not they were using cubes or drawings, I thought I would probably see that from some students. So the asset that I pulled out from that is that they understand that it's about apples and that you've got two different people with some number of apples. And so they're already thinking about that context. The second piece, I thought I would see kids who just go straight to the equation. So writing 12 plus 13 and getting an answer of 25. With the asset map, it then asks you, has specific questions that can guide you to what do we do when we see this, so that kids can get to that grade level thinking or that understanding. With that first example there with Marlon and Malia, I asked, what will the answer tell you? Sometimes we ask students to reread the question, and they can reread the question without really understanding what it means. But if we ask something like, what will the answer tell you? And they're able to say that the answer will tell us the number of apples Malia picked, and we know that we're trying to find out how many apples she picked. So in this situation, Malia wouldn't have 13 apples because we're trying to find out how many apples she picked. So that understanding right there could help kids make sense of the problem. With the equation at the bottom, thinking about adding labels, not just 12 apples plus 13 apples is 25 apples, but the number of apples that Marlon has plus 13 more apples is equal to the number of apples Malia has. So these were the two kind of pieces that I anticipated seeing from students when I planned for this task. So these are two examples of student work. The very first one, you can see the student drew a picture. She was doing 10 frame, like a base 10 blocks. So she labeled, she had 12 for Marlon's apples and 13 for Malia's apples, and did have an answer of 25 apples for Malia. The second student, where you can see the scribbles, he originally wrote Malia's apples next to that 13. So again, Marlon's apples 12, Malia's apples 13, and then the answer with 25. So thinking about students' representations here and how are we showing this as a comparison, they were understanding that we're finding out a total number of apples, so we could build from that, but really making sense of then, what is that 13? Is that Malia's apples? Is that something else? So these were two examples of ways that I saw students represent the information. The third one here, where somebody did draw a base 10 blocks for Marlon to having 12, and then Malia, and he labeled it as 13 more. So our conversation when we came back together as a class was really about those quantities and what it means in the problem. So if we're finding out the number of apples Malia has, and she has 25 apples, then what does that 13 represent, and how could we show that as a relationship? So I asked students to think about using the cubes, since no one had drawn like a bar model to represent this. They were all kind of thinking about it in a different way. I asked them, how might we use cubes to show Marlon's apples? And then a student came up and was able to put together 12 cubes. And then how might we show how many more Malia has? Let's add 13 onto that. So we kind of created this together from what students already were thinking about. They didn't yet have a way to show this with that direct relationship, but we could build it together and then eventually move into something like a bar model where students could see that comparison in a different way. So all of this, this building was really based on what I saw from students and being able to think about those relationships and what the numbers represented in the problem to get them to understand the comparison. Throughout the year, I also had time to work with a bunch of first grade teachers. They tried out plenty of math milestone tasks and asset maps. And I wanted to share some of the quotes that they had with you. So I will stop talking and let you guys read those for a minute. The one thing that I took away from listening to teachers is that having them step outside of the curriculum momentarily and just using a math milestone task with an asset map to support them, it really uncovered different ways that students were thinking and reasoning mathematically that they may not have seen in their regular instruction. And so this was a way to step outside and see those assets from kids and how to build on that understanding. And then I also asked them to think about their own learning or their own instructional practice. So here are some of the things that teachers said about it afterwards. So all teachers in this case were thinking differently about how they implement their curricular tasks with an emphasis on sense making. So when they went back to looking at the curriculum, they said, in this lesson, there's no sense making. Kids aren't asked to make sense of things or think. So how will I facilitate this task so that I can do that? What questions can I ask teachers or ask students to help move them toward that learning goal? And finally, the last piece is thinking about what's next for me with asset maps. One thing I want to do is incorporate opportunities for students to write about their mathematical ideas. In this case, we did lots of talking, but I know that writing can help students reflect and clarify their own understandings. So I would like to have opportunities for them to do their writing after the conversations. To consolidate some of their thinking, as well as teaching students to self-question. What I found was a lot of the questions I was asking during these tasks could be asked with any task. So something like, what could you draw to represent the situation, or how could you show this? That doesn't matter what task it is. As soon as the kids were prompted with that, they had a way to get going or to keep moving. So the kids that don't get started right away or get stuck somewhere, just from prompting them with what could you draw or how could you build this, it gets them moving in the direction of thinking. And so if they can ask themselves that question when they are posed with a task, like what can I draw? How could I represent this? Then that will just develop their self-efficacy and kind of get them moving in the right direction. That is all.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's so incredible to hear the story each time. And I want to point you to the chat to some resonance that you're getting there. We're going to hear from Ariel McDaniel, and then we'll raise any questions for our educators after. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Ariel.
All right. Well, hello. My name is Ariel McDaniel. Currently, I'm residing out of Tampa, Florida, where I've been an educator for the past 10 years. However, over the past 4 years, I've had an opportunity to serve in the role as an instructional math coach, where I'm supporting both teachers and students. This past school year, having an opportunity to work with student achievement partners through the Math Milestones initiative has definitely allowed me to shift my mindset, as well as my philosophy in math for building both the capacity of teachers and students. So I'm excited to share this with you. Something that drew me to the asset maps initially was from the lens of an instructional coach. However, as a 5th grade teacher, it also allowed me, it provided a blueprint to identifying those student assets, to provide meaningful questions, to just enhance those tasks and really engage the student discourse. Okay, so taking you a little bit through my process, through selection. Initially, I would start by selecting a task, taking a moment to anticipate how do I think students are going to solve that particular task, and then actually solving the task. 2 questions that I would keep in mind during this process was, how do I make this task accessible to all students? What assets might students have? Okay. So before launching the Math Milestone task, this takes place in a 5th grade classroom. Just taking a moment here to look at the standard along with some of our math and practices. Okay. So initially planning using a task, there were 3 steps that I normally would take before engaging a task. The first one being, what prior knowledge are students going to bring with this task to be able to make sense of it? The second one being, what strategies are students going to use to access this task? And then as that teacher, what questions am I going to ask to generate that student discourse? So taking a look, the asset maps provided an opportunity to not only anticipate what solutions students may bring, but also anticipate what questions we could ask to make connections with that student learning. All right, so taking a look at a few student work samples from this particular task, just taking a moment to allow students to show and explain their thinking, as well as to make connections. One thing I wanted to emphasize about assets, I think Phil said it earlier, is doing the work to understand. And understanding that assets can be discovered through both talk and through student work as well. So just a few more student examples, something to just make a point to point out here, just making connections and getting students to initiate that student discourse, asking questions to allow them to talk about their thinking. In just a moment, you'll take a look at students actually working to complete this particular task, just taking a moment to glance inside that particular classroom as students work collaboratively to respond to a task. Okay. So as we prepare this video, just take a moment. As you're watching, we want you to think about what assets do you hear and or see, and we welcome you to place those in the chat.
Corner store. Aria and Lily's house is 1/5 mile from the store. If Aria ran 1/3 of the way from her house to the store, how far in miles did Aria run?
Lily ran past the store, and Aria, that's her name, Aria?
Mm-hmm.
She ran to the store. Because 1/3 and 2/3 is on the number. I don't know how to explain it, but like.
Okay, somebody chime in and help?
So Aria ran like 1/5. Aria ran 1/3 of the way from her house to the store. So she technically, so the store is 1/5, but she only ran 1/3 of that 1/5. So one.
So we welcome you now. Are there any assets that you hear or can see through that portion of the video? You see, knowing what that story is about, what the story is asking, the asset of knowing what the fraction part represents, understand that it's part of a fraction, absolutely. Being able to capture those quantities. Understanding the problem itself, absolutely. Okay.
1/3 of 1/5. We obviously know that's multiplication, so we need to multiply 1/3 times 1/5 is 1 times 1 is 2 and 3 times 5 is 15. So Aria ran 2. Wait. 2 1 times 1 is 1. Oh yeah. My bad. She was waiting for that too. 1 and 15. See, Aria ran 1/15 miles. So Lily ran 2/15 because she ran 2/3. So she ran 2/3 of that 1/5.
All right, so thank you. I see a lot of activity in the chat. Knowing that 1/3 of, yes, showing the same in the total of that distance. Knowing that 1/2 of 1/5 is great. Representing, showing the same total distance. A lot of the comments in the chat are both related to what's happening in that classroom when they were making sense of what the problem was actually asking. I see representing and showing the same total distance. Okay. And yes, our students articulating their understanding through the tasks, through their own genuine discourse.
Any questions for this group? I'm gonna give y'all 1 minute to ask questions. Go ahead.
How did you know that it was multiplication?
Because this
But why did you get multiplication?
We got multiplication because it's 1/3 of 1/5. So 1 of 1/5.
But I still don't understand that. The store is
that
1/5. If she only ran this much, that's
when we got multiplication.
that's 1/3.
All All right, so give me just an opportunity, to reflect on the student experience or my student experience from exploring this particular task. There were 3 big takeaways. My first one being that there were evidence of the math norms. Our math norms consisted of making sense, showing your work, and 3, being able to explain your thinking. The second one being creating that culture and community and collaboration where students feel welcome and free to express their thoughts, their ideas to one another in that culture that's of collaboration. Some of the standout language that I heard was, but how do you know it's multiplication? Just students feeling comfortable enough to not challenge, but ask each other those questions. Being able to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't know how to explain this, but I still don't understand. 2 of the standouts statements in that particular video was, it's 1/3 of 1/5. But she only ran 1/3 of the 1/5. So taking a moment and being able to recognize and identify that all students are coming with assets, but as that educator, are we taking a moment to kind of stand back, listen for those, what are we looking for as well? So what's next for me? Definitely continuing to support the work of Asset Maps, whether it's with my district, along with the community of coaches I currently support, and then continuing to share my classroom experiences with various tasks and Asset Maps that we had an opportunity to engage in over this past year throughout this work with SAP.
Thank you so much, Ariel. I also want to point you to the chat for all the celebration and recognition of the classroom culture that you've built that allows for this asset-based approach to really thrive. And we wanted to kind of raise a question or 2 from the chat for Rachel and Ariel to respond to, and then we'll have Phil provide some words before we close out for the day. So I'm going to turn over to Sandra to raise the question.
Yeah, hi. Great to hear from all of you. And again, all the responses when we were practicing. We were hoping you were going to see the things you saw. And so it's just so affirming that you did. One specific question that came up, and Rachel and Ariel, if you want to respond to, I think is one that we're kind of used to, which is like, when do you decide when to use a math milestones task? We know that these aren't curricula and that these are, just tasks. And so if you could kind of reflect on any thoughts that went into the decision making about, when to pull in a task.
So for me and working with different teachers in different grade levels, it really is part of that conversation when you're looking at the standards of a unit and pulling out those essential standards, and then what tasks align with the standards, and then what's the purpose of using the task. So it definitely depends on what your purpose is. For example, in that 2nd grade lesson, it was near the end of the unit when we were starting to look at the asset map, and we said students really have not had any opportunity to engage in this type of thinking with a comparison problem, but they have had a lot of opportunity with comparing with the different set known. So what would happen if we gave them a task that was asking them to shift their thinking a little bit? So we used it near the end of the unit. In 1st grade, students were just going to be starting a unit on place value. And so we wanted to find out, what are they already thinking about 10s and 1s? So in kindergarten, it's 10 ones and some more ones. And so the idea of place value and breaking up into 10s and 1s, adding 10s and adding 1s. So we chose a task from 1st grade to use before the unit. So we could already start to see what kids are thinking about some place value concepts. In 3rd grade, there are a couple lessons in the curriculum that we use on unit fractions. And so we decided we would use a task about unit fractions that asks students to generalize unit fractions to other denominators that they didn't experience in the lesson. And so it was after a specific lesson on that content. So it really definitely just depends on your purpose, your goals, what are you trying to uncover from students, and how you want to kind of move them toward that grade level piece.
Great, thanks.
Ariel, do you want to add on, or should we turn it to Phil?
I would just echo with Rachel, definitely being purpose driven for the reason you're actually sharing that particular task. What do you want to get out of that? Whether one of the things I love when Phil says it's not about answer getting, but uncovering what students are bringing, being able to identify what assets, where they are at the current moment. So there's no particular time, but just echoing Rachel, just being purposeful in why you're selecting that particular task.
Thank you, Ariel. I'll turn it over to Phil to close with some thoughts before we talk about opportunities.
Two thoughts. One, where are the assets? They're in what the students make, what the students say, what the students show you. And I think we saw in these examples just that. And student talk is often the first place where you'll see what they're bringing to the task. And the asset maps have questions for the teachers, the prompting questions that fit each of the different ways of thinking that you'll see among the students. So we went through the trouble to figure out what were the common ways students would think about this task. Where the question about where this fits in the curriculum, when to use it, it's important to realize that any curriculum, some more than others, has some implicit scaffolding for the students. They're over scaffolded in a lot of ways. So when a student's working on problem 4, they don't have to think about whether to multiply or whatever, because this chapter is about multiplying. So all the problems are about multiplying. So I don't need to make sense of the problem. I'm just going to see the numbers and I'm going to multiply them because that's what this chapter is about. That level of scaffolding really leads to the students not thinking enough about the mathematics and instead just cranking out the answers while they're kind of half asleep. So it's important to step out of the curriculum with some frequency and give them problems where they actually have to make sense. You don't want that to happen just when they're taking the state test or just when they're taking some other kind of test where the problems are not embedded in the middle of a chapter. And so in a way, whenever you use the milestones task as a time to step out of the curriculum and make sense of some mathematics, it's going to serve a good purpose. I find the most useful things that teachers have told us are either at the beginning of a chapter to help them understand what students are bringing to a unit, or halfway through the chapter to see what they're learning so far and what's sticking and what's not. These were not designed as summative assessment items. These are formative. So I wouldn't use these as an end of unit test. I would use them when there's still time to do something about what you see and what you hear from the students. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Sandra.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate all that, Ariel and Rachel as well. So this is all very exciting work. Hopefully, if you haven't engaged with or heard about Math Milestones before, I'll just remind you about June's opening. We have another webinar that we did about a year ago about Math Milestones in general, and this is one specific application that we've been working on very much in partnership with this Educator group that we've been working on. So what I want to share with you next is some opportunities quite specifically that you can get involved with our work in the development of these asset maps. So go to the next slide, June. So one of the things that we're very committed to at Student Achievement Partners is working with practitioners. We don't fancy ourselves as lab workers that work in isolation of the real people and the real problems that exist in schools. And so we feel very strongly that the only way that the things that we design are effective is if we work directly with folks in districts to help us, give us feedback, what's working, and so on. And so we still have some big questions around the asset maps themselves. Some of those questions are listed here on the slide: the effectiveness of the design of the product itself, how much support do folks need to be able to effectively use these asset maps, We wonder about the actual impact that the maps are having on the activities that teachers are engaging in their own practice. And we also wonder about what school level conditions best support the use of asset maps. So rather than us just sitting around a circle staring at each other to try to answer these questions, we know that it would be important for us to engage with some district folks to better seek out the answers to these questions. So we are looking for right now a few district partners that might want to support us in this work. So specifically, when we think about our ideal district profile, we're looking for a district that has adopted a curriculum and has expectations for the teachers in how they would in fact engage in the implementation of that curriculum. So basically a district that cares about the curriculum that they've adopted and communicates that to teachers. We're also interested in very core, as you heard today, to the value of this product is that there's a value for an asset-based approach to teaching. So we know that's an easy thing to speak to, but not so easy to do in practice. And so we're interested in districts who have named this as something that they're interested in so that we can leverage the asset maps to support that commitment. And then third, we feel like for this partnership work, it would be great to work with a district that has coaches, can directly work with teachers that could continuously support the translation of the asset maps into classrooms. So what we're looking for the upcoming school year is about a 4 to 5 month engagement that would include kind of some check-in calls, what's working. You share questions with us, we share questions with you, hopefully answers go back and forth, and likely at least one on-site visit where we have the opportunity to actually see the students, see the teachers, hear the conversations that are going on. In our work now at Student Achievement Partners, you see the words on the bottom of these slides. I'll just share with you that this is a product that we intend to build out and eventually sell once we have some of these development questions on board. So to that end, the partnership would include some requirement of a very low fee, mostly to cover our travel and staff costs in this development work. But we think it's an exciting opportunity both to be on the cutting edge of a design of what we think will be a very powerful tool, as well as to inform our own learning in this work going forward. And I think we've included the link that you could sign up if you are interested. And I think June's going to talk a bit about another opportunity for individual collaborators distinct from district partnerships.
Thank you, Sandra. Yes, we are also looking for individual collaborators, specifically for classroom teachers who may have multiple years of experience teaching a particular grade level, and who've also cultivated a classroom culture of mathematical discourse. We'll share more about the opportunity and ways to apply for this opportunity in the coming weeks. So we invite you at this moment, if you're interested in learning more about that, to sign up to hear more about this opportunity. But I want us to have some time to explore the two links that we're going to close today with, which is, again, the district interest form that Sandra just spoke to. We're having the next 2 weeks is kind of like an open time for folks to express their interest before we kind of do a first round of review to see what the interest looks like. And if you are interested in just kind of like having a conversation, before directly expressing your interest via a form, we are really serious in saying, please reach out. Sandra loves talking to people. We love talking to you all too and answering your questions. So definitely, if you want to start there, let's start there before we do the district interest form. But if you already know that you're ready, this is the link to express that interest. And then also, we welcome feedback from everybody on today's webinar about the content. And at the end of the feedback form, once you submit it, you'll receive your PD certification. So we wanted to take about 5 minutes for folks to kind of explore either link and grab the link for the other one before we close out for the day.